Imagine standing on a sweltering July morning in 1588 within the hallowed shadows of Greenwich Palace. The air, thick and heavy, is not just with the humid promise of summer rain, but with a far more unsettling cocktail, the mingled scents of unwashed bodies, the putrid decay of rotting rushes strewn across floors, and the cloying, sickly sweet perfume courtiers douse themselves in, desperate to mask the unspeakable realities beneath. You hear the rustle of silk, the soft murmur of hushed voices, and then the majestic entrance of Queen Elizabeth I's, Gloriana herself. She sits resplendent on her throne, a vision in cloth of gold and pearls, her pale face painted white as fresh snow. But as she smiles, revealing teeth the color of autumn leaves, and as courtiers lean forward, not just in reverence, but because the distance makes her words easier to bear, a chilling question arises. What if the most powerful woman in the world, the Virgin Queen who defied the Spanish Armada and ruled England with an iron fist, was also trapped in a gilded cage of unimaginable filth and decay? This is not the Elizabeth Tudor you know from romanticized paintings or heroic tales. This is the unvarnished truth of a monarch ensnared by the dark ages of hygiene and medicine, a prisoner of her own vanity and the toxic beauty standards of her time. We will delve beyond the magnificent facade, past the legends of Gloriana, to expose the revolting personal habits and the horrifying self-inflicted decay that slowly consumed England's greatest queen. How could a ruler of such immense intellect and iron will succumb to conditions that would horrify us today? This is the paradox at the heart of her reign, a beacon of strength and political prowess, yet a decaying shell beneath the elaborate gowns and pristine white paint, haunted by a stench no civet musk could conquer. Join us as we peel back the layers of history, not to revel in the grotesque, but to understand the profound psychological cost of power, the tyranny of image, and the brutal reality of human vulnerability even within the highest echelons of royalty. What does it reveal about the human condition when denial becomes a crown heavier than gold, and victory is purchased at the cost of one's own flesh and sanity? Prepare to discover a chapter of history often whispered, rarely fully told, a story that will forever change your perception of Queen Elizabeth I and force you to confront the unsettling echoes of the past within our own understanding of human nature. The whispers began subtly, like the rustle of dry leaves carried on an autumn breeze through the ancient stones of Greenwich Palace. It was the year of our Lord 1588, a time when England, under the iron will of Queen Elizabeth I, had just repelled the might of the Spanish Armada. A golden age, they called it, an epic of unparalleled triumph and burgeoning national pride. And at its very heart stood Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, a living legend adorned in the finest silks and jewels, her pale face a canvas of serene, almost ethereal beauty. She moved with a regal grace, her every gesture a carefully choreographed display of power and majesty. To stand in her presence was to breathe the very air of authority, to witness the embodiment of divine right. Courtiers jostled for her glance, poets penned odes to her wisdom, and ambassadors from across Europe spoke of her unparalleled intellect and diplomatic prowess. Her court was a vibrant tapestry of intrigue, ambition, and dazzling spectacle, where the very air seemed to shimmer with the promise of greatness. Yet, beneath the glittering facade of power and the sweet scent of 1,000 pomanders, a more insidious reality began to fester. The humid July mornings, heavy with the promise of summer rain, also carried a scent far less noble than the court's perfumes. It was a subtle, earthy musk, intertwined with something sharp, metallic like copper pennies left in stagnant water. It clung to the heavy velvet tapestries, seeped into the very wood of the palace, a ghost of an odor that defied the most potent of floral masks. No one spoke of it openly, for to acknowledge such a thing was to challenge the perfection of Gloriana herself. But it was there, a growing disquiet in the otherwise harmonious symphony of court life. It was a silent testament to a world where cleanliness was not merely difficult, but often feared, where the very act of bathing was considered by many to be a dangerous invitation to disease and ill humors. For Elizabeth, like many of her era, personal hygiene was less a ritual of purification and more a grudging concession to the most pressing needs. Dictated by beliefs born of superstition and rudimentary understanding of the human body, she did bathe, a remarkable feat for her time, once every 3 months, or as she herself famously quipped, whether I need it or not. This was, by 16th century standards, a remarkably progressive habit, considering most of her subjects went years, even a lifetime, without a full immersion. The common wisdom held that water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to the invisible agents of pestilence and the dark whispers of evil spirits. Thus, a layer of grime, a protective film of accumulated sweat and dead skin, was often seen not as a mark of squalor, but as a necessary shield against a hostile world. And so, within the hallowed halls where England's destiny was shaped, the Queen's personal routines, a silent agreement between her and her servants, laid the groundwork for a peculiar, insidious transformation. It was a subtle discord in the grand chorus of her reign, a mere whisper of dis-ease beneath the surface of ultimate power. Yet it carried the chilling prelude to a tragedy that would unfold not in battlefields or political arenas, but within the very confines of her own flesh. The insidious roots of Elizabeth's undoing were not planted by a cunning assassin or a rival monarch, but by the invisible hand of ignorance and the relentless march of time. The true antagonist in this unfolding drama was a complex, multi-headed beast, the primitive state of 16th century medicine, the prevailing superstitions regarding health, and perhaps most tragically, the Queen's own vanity and unwavering adherence to the aesthetic standards of her age. It was a society that worshipped paleness as a sign of nobility, where a radiant, untouched complexion was the epitome of beauty. To achieve this, Elizabeth, like countless ladies of her court, embraced Venetian carusse, a seemingly magical concoction of white lead and vinegar applied daily. In thick, meticulous layers, it promised an alabaster glow, a flawless mask over the imperfections of mortal flesh. It was a poison in plain sight, a silent killer disguised as an enhancer of beauty, its slow, corrosive effects ignored in the relentless pursuit of an impossible ideal. Beyond the perilous allure of lead Another, more beguiling enemy lay hidden within the sugar bowl. In an era when sugar was a luxury, more precious than gold, it became a potent symbol of status, power, and wealth. Elizabeth, with her insatiable sweet tooth, indulged in it with reckless abandon. Marchpanes, sugared violets, candied fruits, and sweet wines were not mere treats, but daily staples, nibbled and sipped throughout her long hours of statecraft. Each crystal dissolved slowly on her tongue, bathing her teeth in a sugary torrent. A ritual of sweet decay that, unknown to her, was systematically dismantling her dazzling smile. There was no concept of dental hygiene as we know it: no brushing, no flossing, no regular cleaning. The best available care was an occasional rinse with wine or rose water, which, ironically, contained more sugar, accelerating the very decay it sought to mitigate. This lack of understanding, combined with the era's rudimentary medical knowledge, forged a silent conspiracy against her health. Physicians, baffled by her ailments, often resorted to bizarre and ineffective remedies, such as rinsing with urine or applying hot irons, compounding the damage rather than alleviating it. The very air she breathed, laden with the waste of a burgeoning city and the effluvia of 1,000 unwashed bodies, formed another layer of this quiet siege. The River Thames, from which her bath water was drawn, was a murky conduit of London's waste, sewage, dead animals, and industrial runoff from tanneries and workshops. Her soap, a crude mixture of rancid animal fat, wood ash, and lye, was more likely to strip skin than cleanse it, a caustic assault rather than a balm. This was the silent, inexorable force against which Elizabeth, despite all her worldly power, waged a losing battle. The tension lay in the stark contrast: a queen who commanded navies and parliaments, yet was utterly powerless against the microscopic invaders and toxic substances that, in plain sight, were slowly, relentlessly consuming her from within. Each choice, each habit, each prevailing belief of her time, once seemingly innocuous, was a thread in the tightening noose, pulling her deeper into a quagmire from which there would be no escape. The stage was set, not for a grand conflict of nations, but for an intimate, horrifying tragedy of the human body and spirit. The transformation was gradual, insidious, like the slow creep of ivy across an ancient wall. But the genesis of Elizabeth's irreversible decline could be traced to a collection of seemingly innocuous daily rituals that, over time, culminated in an inescapable turning point. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm, but the steady accumulation of toxic practices and the burgeoning failure of her regal body, the blackening of her teeth. Perhaps the most public and infamous of her hygiene disasters became an undeniable marker. By her 40s, the relentless assault of sugar had rendered them completely black, a shocking contrast to her porcelain white complexion. This was no mere cosmetic flaw. It was a testament to excruciating, persistent pain. Contemporary accounts speak of teeth crumbling mid-sentence, leaving dark fragments on her lips, of days spent unable to eat solid food, subsisting only on broths and pain-dulling concoctions. Courtiers learned to interpret her hand, often pressing against her jaw during public appearances, a silent signal of agony, a momentary crack in the otherwise impenetrable facade of Gloriana. Simultaneously, the insidious effects of lead poisoning began to manifest in ways that could no longer be masked. The daily applications of ceruse, meant to preserve her youthful pallor, were in fact systematically destroying her skin, turning it into a landscape of weeping sores and lesions. Each morning, fresh layers of poison were applied over the raw, damaged flesh, creating a beautiful yet hideous mask that would crack and flake throughout the day. Sir John Harrington, a contemporary courtier and inventor of the flush toilet, recorded in his private journals the pervasive, almost suffocating aroma that began to follow the queen. A complex blend of rancid perfume, unwashed skin, and the sickly sweet decay of her mouth. This wasn't just a matter of personal discomfort, it became a diplomatic concern. A telling incident from 1579 AD, recorded in court documents, speaks of the French ambassador lamenting in a letter to his king that he was forced to hold a pomander of sweet herbs to his nose during an audience with the queen. So overwhelming was the royal person amid such odor as to make close conversation a trial of endurance. Even more strikingly, the ambassador's wife fainted during a formal dinner, officially attributed to heat, but privately understood to be from the overwhelming effluvium emanating from the royal table. This was the undeniable pivot. The private struggle had become a public spectacle, albeit one shrouded in the polite fictions of courtly life. Elizabeth could command armies, control parliaments, and inspire unwavering loyalty, but she could not command her own decaying flesh. The choices she made, born of societal pressures and personal vanity, had set her on a path of irreversible decline. Her life, once defined by triumphs and shrewd political maneuverings, was now irrevocably bound to the horrifying reality of her physical deterioration. The whispers would grow louder, the subtle glances more knowing, as Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, was inexorably drawn into a spiraling dance with decay, a dance from which no royal decree or military victory could ever free her. Her world, once seemingly pristine and perfectly controlled, was now permeated by an unseen enemy, marking her forever. The quiet indignities of decay, once mere whispers, now demanded a louder response. Elizabeth, ever the monarch of meticulous control, reacted not with surrender, but with a heightened resolve to reassert her dominion over her own decaying form. Her initial strategy was simple, yet ultimately futile if the body betrayed her. Then she would simply conceal its treachery with an even grander facade. Each morning, the ritual of her toilette transformed into an elaborate battlefield. The ceruse, once a gentle layer, became a thick, plaster-like mask, applied with a painter's precision to obscure the increasingly mottled and scarred landscape of her natural skin. It burned as it was applied, a silent testament to the caustic blend of lead and vinegar eating away at her flesh. But she endured it, a martyr to the exacting demands of her public image. She would remain motionless for up to an hour while it dried. A queen frozen in a grotesque tableau, unable to speak, eat, or even take a sip of water. lest a crack betray the fragile illusion. Her infamous red hair, once a vibrant symbol of her Tudor lineage, had begun to thin dramatically, a consequence of the lead's pervasive poison and the harsh, ineffective treatments she employed in desperate attempts to restore it. To combat this visible sign of decline, the queen embraced wigs with an almost obsessive fervor. These elaborate constructions, often fashioned from the hair of peasant women hair that was frequently unwashed and infested with lice, became an integral part of her daily disguise. They were never truly cleaned, only brushed and dusted with fragrant powders, accumulating layers of sweat, oil, and the grime of the palace air. Yet, Elizabeth would boast of her beautiful red locks, seemingly oblivious to the transparent deceit, or perhaps in a tragic act of self-preservation. She had simply convinced herself of the illusion's reality. Her denial was a shield, thick and unyielding, protecting her from the harsh reflection in the mirror, a reflection that whispered of a vulnerability she would not acknowledge. The court, a master of polite fictions, played along, their gazes carefully averted from the subtle tells the phantom sense, the almost imperceptible flaking of her skin, the unnatural stillness of her face. It was a silent, collective conspiracy to maintain the myth of Gloriana. Even as the truth began to claw its way to the surface. And so, the grand charade continued, each escalating symptom met with a corresponding increase in concealment. If the body produced an offense, it would be drowned in perfume. If the breath became foul, it would be masked by sugared violets. This was Elizabeth's initial, desperate attempt to control the narrative of her own physical decay. A monarchical decree against the undeniable forces of nature and neglect. Yet, this very act of defiance, this relentless pursuit of an impossible ideal, only served to accelerate the very horror she sought to hide. The battle, it seemed, had only just begun, and the queen, blinded by the very halo of her power, was ill-equipped to fight an enemy that resided not in a foreign land, but within the decaying fortress of her own flesh. As the months bled into years, the quiet skirmishes against decay escalated into a full-blown siege. The very tools Elizabeth employed to maintain her regal image became instruments of her own torment, pushing her further into a world of physical and psychological isolation. The heavy silk and velvet gowns, never washed, became repositories of accumulated filth. Imagine the sheer weight of these garments, sometimes exceeding 50 pounds when fully jeweled, creating a suffocating greenhouse effect that trapped heat and moisture, inducing profuse sweating. This bodily effluvium, absorbed deep into the innermost fabric layers, created a permanent personal miasma that no amount of airing or reperfuming could ever truly dissipate. Courtiers, though ever polite, learned to recognize the queen's approaching presence not by sight alone, but by the unique, cloying scent that preceded her, a complex symphony of unwashed body, rancid perfumes, and the faint, unsettling whiff of decay. The queen's dental disaster, once merely a subject of hushed whispers, had by now blossomed into an international scandal. Her teeth, once merely discolored, had become entirely black and rotten, a grotesque testament to her insatiable appetite for sugar. Foreign ambassadors, whose detailed reports were the tabloids of their day, chronicled her horrifying smile with barely concealed amusement, noting that the queen's teeth are so black and rotten that it is a wonder she can speak at all. The pain was constant, a gnawing torment that left her unable to chew solid food for days, forcing her to subsist on broths and watery concoctions. This physical agony inevitably bled into her mental state. Imagine the perpetual discomfort, the raw, bleeding gums, the metallic taste of blood mingling with her saliva, the ever-present threat of infection spreading to her throat and sinuses. Such chronic suffering, endured daily, chipped away at her legendary composure, feeding a growing irritability and a gnawing sense of helplessness that contradicted her public persona of unbreakable strength. Yet, perhaps the most horrifying escalation lay in the living ecosystem that thrived beneath her elaborate wigs. These were not merely fashion statements, they were breeding grounds. Lice, drawn to the warm, moist environment of unwashed hair and decomposing organic matter, flourished in the dark confines of the hairpieces. Ladies in waiting, with stoic faces, would spend hours each day painstakingly picking these parasites from the queen's wigs, a grim and silent testament to the intimate horrors of her daily life. But the parasites always returned, a relentless, creeping torment, the queen, plagued by incessant itching and the weeping sores on her scalp caused by lead poisoning, would sometimes be observed scratching frantically at her head during public appearances, drawing blood and creating fresh wounds beneath the elaborate coiffure. This wasn't merely discomfort, it was a physical manifestation of an invisible enemy consuming her, a stark counterpoint to the image of Gloriana she so desperately projected. The escalating decay was not just a physical burden, it was a profound psychological weight, a constant, nagging reminder of her mortal vulnerability, a truth she fought with every fiber of her being to deny. The pervasive, almost supernatural intensity of Elizabeth's personal odors eventually became an undeniable revelation, a shocking truth that could no longer be contained by polite courtly pretense or the most potent of perfumes. It was a stench that permeated the very fabric of the palace, clinging to the air, to the furnishings, even to the courtiers themselves. Long after the queen had departed, servants, whose intimate access afforded them a ghastly proximity, would sometimes flee the approach of their sovereign, not out of disrespect, but from an instinctual, visceral revulsion to the overwhelming effluvium that preceded her. It was a composite odor, a horrifying symphony of unwashed skin, infected wounds, the putrid decay of rotting teeth, and the increasingly rancid perfume she doused herself in, creating a concoction that courtiers described, in hushed, terrified whispers, as the scent of death itself. This was no longer a subtle disquiet. It was a full-blown assault on the senses, an undeniable declaration that the magnificent facade of Gloriana was crumbling, revealing the horror beneath. The most shocking aspect of this unveiled reality was Elizabeth's apparent denial, or perhaps a desperate, almost delusionary inability to fully comprehend the extent of her own physical degradation. She would, even in her later years, boast of her beautiful red locks, seemingly unaware that every person in her court knew the truth of her elaborate wigs, which foreign ambassadors meticulously described in their dispatches, often with thinly veiled amusement. Her attempts to mask her oral problems, the constant chewing of herbs like mint and rosemary, the rinsing with wine and honey, all were feudal against the underlying rot. These sugary concoctions, ironically, only fed the bacteria, exacerbating the problem, a self-perpetuating cycle of decay that she seemed powerless, or perhaps unwilling, to break. The queen, who effortlessly navigated the treacherous waters of international diplomacy, was utterly lost in the more intimate, yet equally perilous, currents of her own declining health. This revelation, stark and inescapable, marked a profound turning point. It exposed the brutal truth that Elizabeth's enemy was not Spain or France, but an internal, insidious force that mocked her power and defied her will. The extent of the problem was now undeniable, a constant, sensory assault on anyone in her proximity. The meticulously constructed image of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, whose purity was said to embody England itself, was now being brutally undermined by the very reality of her decaying flesh. This was the moment of chilling recognition. The problem was far more entrenched, far more powerful than anyone, including Elizabeth herself, had imagined. The psychological burden of this public, undeniable decay began to weigh heavily, stripping away layers of her regal composure, leaving behind a woman increasingly isolated by her own decaying existence. The great queen, once a symbol of unblemished power, was now a poignant testament to the fragility of the human form. Even when draped in cloth of gold and surrounded by the awe of nations, the true horror had begun to reveal itself, not through a single, dramatic event, but through the overwhelming, undeniable evidence of her relentless physical decline. The year 1590 marked an irreversible turning point, not in the grand sweep of England's geopolitical landscape, but in the intimate, horrifying decline of its monarch. Elizabeth's persistent denial, her stubborn refusal to acknowledge the escalating degradation of her own body, became a public declaration, a macabre theater played out on the grand stage of her court. It was not a single, dramatic decision, but a compounding of choices, each one hardening her resolve to cling to the illusion of unchanging perfection, even as reality screamed its truth. The most egregious of these was her unwavering commitment to ceruse, the toxic white lead and vinegar concoction. Despite the visibly decaying skin beneath, despite the chronic fatigue and memory lapses that had begun to plague her, symptoms now recognized by astute courtiers as signs of lead poisoning, she refused to abandon her signature white mask. This was more than vanity. It was a desperate attempt to exert control over a body that was relentlessly betraying her, a monarchical decree against the very laws of nature. The consequences of this unyielding stance were profound and deeply personal. The queen's skin, once admired for its pallor, became a gruesome tapestry of sores, scars, and discoloration. Years of lead poisoning had left her face pitted and ravaged, with deep lesions that would weep and crust over, only to be covered with fresh, lethal layers of cosmetic poison each morning. Her natural complexion, when glimpsed, had taken on a sickly yellow-green hue, a chilling indicator of liver damage and internal afflictions wrought by the accumulated toxins and the crude, often harmful, herbal remedies she consumed. Her hair loss became almost complete, a direct result of the lead's pervasive assault, leaving her scalp a battleground of infected sores and scarred tissue. Wigs, once a fashion statement, transformed into an absolute necessity, growing heavier and more elaborate as she desperately tried to compensate for her increasing baldness. Schultz. Yet, the constant pressure and weight of these hairpieces only exacerbated her scalp problems, trapping heat and moisture, preventing proper healing, and perpetuating cycles of infection. The air in her private chambers, particularly her sleeping quarters, became heavy, thick with the mingled odors of unwashed body, stale perfumes, and the pungent, medicinal tang of various ointments applied to her festering skin. It was an atmosphere so oppressive that servants entering in the morning would often gag or struggle to hold their breath, a grim testament to the queen's living hell. This unyielding commitment to her toxic beauty regimen, despite the visible, escalating horror, was her great tragic decision. It was a conscious denial of mortality, a defiant refusal to allow time and decay to claim their victory. But in doing so, she inadvertently ensured a far more grotesque defeat. The physical deterioration, once a private struggle, now openly mocked the very power she sought to project. The image of Gloriana, so carefully cultivated, began to crack, revealing not just a glimpse, but a full, terrifying panorama of decay. The court, once a stage for her triumphs, was slowly transforming into a silent witness to her undoing, held captive by the very presence of a sovereign consumed by the slow, inexorable march of her own internal catastrophe. The direct consequences of Elizabeth's unwavering commitment to her destructive habits were not merely physical. They began to tighten like a suffocating shroud around her, transforming her world into a constant, stifling ordeal. The enemy, once hidden, now moved with brazen certainty within the very walls of her palace, and indeed, within her own flesh, her breath, already legendary for its foulness, now seemed to possess an almost tangible presence, a warm, putrid miasma that clung to the air and the unfortunate souls forced into her close proximity. It was a ghastly fusion of rotting teeth, chronically infected gums, and the rancid oils from her beetle-based lip paints, a smell that courtiers described as worse than the smell of a battlefield after 3 days in the sun. This was not just an unpleasant odor. It was a constant, humiliating assault on her dignity and the politeness of her court. Ambassadors, whose duty it was to engage with her closely, would subtly turn their faces or feign a sudden cough, anything to avoid inhaling the full force of her corrupted exhalation. Her magnificent gowns, which she often wore for days or even weeks without changing, had become grotesque repositories of months of accumulated filth. These opulent garments, woven from the finest silks and velvets, adorned with pearls and precious stones, now absorbed every drop of sweat, every bodily fluid, every stain from her meager diet of broths and soft breads. They transformed into stiff, yellowed canvases, bearing the indelible marks of her nightly struggles and daily discomforts. The weight of them, combined with the restrictive whalebone and steel corsets, created an almost unbearable physical burden, trapping heat and moisture against her ailing skin, further exacerbating the sores and infections that riddled her body. Her feet, long hidden beneath layers of silk stockings and elaborate shoes, suffered perhaps the most ignominious fate. They became breeding grounds for fungal infections, with toenails growing thick, yellowed, and curling inward, causing excruciating pain. The smell emanating from these perpetually moist, infected extremities was distinct and overwhelming, described by her ladies-in-waiting as like rotting cheese mixed with vinegar. Even her shoes, works of art in themselves, became permanent reservoirs of this putrid odor, noticeable even when unworn. The sheer, overwhelming nature of these physical degradations created a living nightmare from which Elizabeth could find no escape. Her sleeping chamber, meant to be a sanctuary of rest and privacy, became a concentrated repository of all her hygiene failures. The elaborate four-poster bed, adorned with cloth of gold hangings, held linens that were changed perhaps monthly, if fortunate, and had become stiff with accumulated sweat, bodily fluids, and the various ointments applied to her skin. The mattress, stuffed with down and feathers, teemed with insects and bacteria, a permanent source of foul odors. This was the suffocating reality of her daily existence, a relentless assault on her senses and her diminishing physical reserves. The world around her, once bowing to her will, was now a constant, humiliating reminder of her losing battle. A confined, oppressive space where every breath, every movement brought her closer to the inescapable truth of her own physical ruin. The ultimate descent into despair for Queen Elizabeth I was not marked by a single dramatic fall, but by the slow, agonizing erosion of everything she held dear: her beauty, her health, her very sense of self. The point of no return arrived when the cumulative effects of her lifelong choices converged, leaving her a prisoner, not of her enemies, but of her own decaying flesh and fracturing mind. Her famed denial, once a formidable shield, now crumbled, leaving her exposed to the brutal truth. The final decade of her life, particularly after the turn of the century, saw her hygiene problems reach a horrifying crescendo, transforming the once glorious queen into a living embodiment of decay and neglect. Her skin became a grotesque patchwork, her face pitted and scarred, the lead poisoning having irrevocably ravaged her once pale complexion. Beneath the fresh layers of toxic cosmetics, her natural skin color had turned a sickly yellow-green, a chilling symptom of liver damage and severe internal problems, likely exacerbated by her primitive medications and inadequate diet. Her hair loss was complete, leaving her scalp a battlefield of weeping sores and scarred tissue. Even the heaviest, most elaborate wigs could not hide the truth, and she was sometimes seen scratching frantically at her head during public appearances, drawing blood and creating fresh wounds that would take weeks to heal. The agony of her rotting teeth had spread, causing chronic inflammation in her throat and sinuses, making speaking and even breathing a painful ordeal. Her diet was reduced to mere broths, soft breads, and liquid medicines. Yet even these simple foods sometimes caused excruciating pain. The magnificent voice that had once commanded parliaments and inspired armies was now often a strained whisper, punctuated by gasps for air. The pervasive, supernatural intensity of her body odor became her constant companion, a horrifying fusion of unwashed skin, infected wounds, rotting teeth, and rancid perfumes. It was a smell courtiers described as the scent of death itself, a harbinger of her approach that cleared rooms and sent servants fleeing in instinctive terror. But perhaps the most devastating loss was that of her sharp, incisive mind. The cumulative effect of lead poisoning and other accumulated toxins began to manifest as chronic fatigue, severe memory problems, and alarming mood swings. She would sometimes forget recent conversations, repeat herself endlessly, or fly into violent rages over minor perceived slights. Her behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, making daily routine management a near impossible task for her long-suffering courtiers. The queen, once the embodiment of political shrewdness and intellectual prowess, was now adrift in a fog of cognitive decline, isolated by her failing body and a mind that no longer fully belonged to her. Stripped of her physical dignity and mental clarity, Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, had reached her lowest ebb. She stood utterly alone, trapped within the decaying fortress of her own body, a prisoner of the very power and image she had so desperately sought to maintain. All hope of recovery, all illusion of control, had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, undeniable reality of her agonizing, solitary decline. As the calendar pages turned to the final years of the 16th century, the battle for Elizabeth's body and mind reached its chilling climax. This was no longer a hidden struggle. It was a visible, agonizing confrontation between the indomitable will of a queen and the relentless, undeniable force of her own physical decay. The once bright beacon of Gloriana now flickered precariously, threatened by the very elements she had, for so long, refused to acknowledge. Her final stand was not on a battlefield against foreign invaders, but within the claustrophobic confines of her royal chambers, a desperate, silent war against the corruption that had permeated her very being. The lead poisoning, the ceaseless infections, the pervasive odors, these were her true adversaries, and they now held the upper hand. The physical torment was relentless. Her once majestic voice, famed for its power and clarity, was now often reduced to a raspy whisper, punctuated by labored gasps for air as the chronic infections from her mouth spread to her throat and sinuses. Eating became an agonizing ordeal, her diet limited to thin broths and soft, tasteless pottage. Yet even these caused excruciating pain as her few remaining, loose teeth ground against raw gums. She was a queen starved, not by want, but by the sheer impossibility of sustenance. Her mind, once a steel trap of political cunning, now wandered. The clarity that had guided England through perilous waters gave way to bouts of forgetfulness, endless repetitions, and sudden, terrifying rages over trivial slights. Courtiers watched in helpless despair as their formidable sovereign was consumed by a fog that deepened with each passing day. They spoke of melancholy humors and royal fevers, polite fictions that scarcely mask the horrifying reality of a mind unraveling. In her final weeks, Elizabeth's defiance became a silent, desperate act of will. She refused to lie down, believing that to recline was to concede to death. For days, she remained standing, propped up by pillows in her chamber, her eyes wide, fixed on some unseen point beyond the velvet drapes. It was a harrowing spectacle. A queen's last, desperate assertion of control over a body that had long since abandoned her. The stench emanating from her, a culmination of all the horrors, the unwashed skin, the weeping sores, the rotting teeth, the rancid perfumes, reached an almost supernatural intensity. It was a suffocating cloud that filled the room, forcing even her most loyal ladies to retreat, gasping for breath. This was her final, agonizing confrontation, a naked struggle against mortality, witnessed by a handful of terrified, exhausted attendants. The once impenetrable mask had fallen, revealing not the face of a queen, but the raw, vulnerable, decaying flesh of a dying woman. A tragic testament to the ultimate futility of denying the inescapable laws of nature. A profound silence descended upon Richmond Palace on March 24th, 1603. It was not the reverent hush that typically accompanies the passing of royalty, but a silence born of exhaustion, of grim relief, and of a deep, unsettling revelation. The woman who had dominated English politics for nearly half a century, the embodiment of a golden age, was finally gone. With her died the elaborate fictions, the gilded veils, and the thick layers of ceruse that had, for so long, hidden her unimaginable personal decay from public view. As the process of preparing her body for burial began, the full, unvarnished extent of the horrors concealed during her lifetime was starkly, viscerally revealed. The servants tasked with this grim duty encountered a woman bearing little resemblance to the iconic portraits that had made her famous. The porcelain white facade was gone, replaced by a mottled, scarred, and discolored landscape of ravaged flesh. Her hair, once her crowning glory, was entirely absent. Her scalp, a testament to years of lead poisoning and chronic infection. The air in the death chamber, once thick with the queen's unique and overwhelming effluvium, remained charged with her presence for weeks, even months, after her passing. It was a persistent, putrid ghost that clung to the tapestries, seeped into the very stone, and defied all attempts at airing and purification. Accounts from the time suggest that some areas of the palace, particularly those closest to the queen's private apartments, were sealed off and abandoned for a considerable period, deemed too contaminated for immediate use. This tangible residue of her physical decline served as a stark, unavoidable epitaph, the triumph over the Spanish Armada, the shrewd diplomacy that secured England's place on the world stage. the booming economy, all paled in comparison to this intimate, physical legacy of decay. Oh, the court, once meticulously choreographed to reflect her grandeur, now breathed a collective, if unacknowledged, sigh of relief. The intricate dance of polite pretense, of feigning ignorance to the palpable stench and the visible deterioration, was over. Her successor, James VI of Scotland, would inherit a kingdom not just politically reshaped, but physically cleansed. The very act of airing out the palaces, of attempting to purge the lingering stench of Elizabeth's final years, became a symbolic, if unconscious, act of starting fresh. It was a poignant end to an extraordinary reign, one that left behind not only a powerful political inheritance, but also a visceral reminder of the human cost of denial and the inescapable truth that even the most formidable of monarchs are, in their finality, but mortal flesh. Return with me, if you will, to the shadows of Greenwich Palace. But now, centuries later, the summer morning air carries only the sweet, clean scent of roses from meticulously tended gardens. The horror has been meticulously sanitized, the truth polished until it gleams like the golden facades that once hid such a revolting reality. The grandeur remains, timeless and imposing, a testament to the power that once resided within these walls. But listen closely. Beyond the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of modern life, and you might still catch the faintest echo of a different era. You might hear the whispered testimonies of long-dead servants, their voices tinged with a mixture of fear and pity. You might discern the stifled gasps of shocked ambassadors, their diplomatic smiles betraying a deep, internal revulsion. And if you listen with your soul, you might even hear the labored breathing of a queen, heavy with the weight of a crown and the crushing burden of her own denied mortality. The story of Queen Elizabeth of Curse, Gloriana, is often told as one of unblemished triumph, of a golden age forged by an iron will. Yet, her most profound, most personal battle was not waged against Spain or France, but against the relentless march of time and the immutable laws of human biology. It was a battle against the very mirror reflecting back the grim price of denying the basic needs of mortal flesh, the cost of clinging to an unsustainable image. This is her true legacy, a poignant, horrifying lesson etched not in stone, but in the decaying essence of a queen. The woman who famously claimed to be married to England died, in fact, wedded only to her own decay. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human condition, the profound psychological cost of maintaining a public facade, the tyranny of societal ideals, and the terrifying vulnerability that even absolute power cannot escape. It reminds us that denial, while offering temporary comfort, ultimately builds a prison of the self, a gilded cage where the soul withers even as the external image shines. Elizabeth Tudor's reign, for all its glory, serves as a stark, unforgettable parable, a testament to how the relentless pursuit of an impossible ideal, coupled with the ignorance of an era, can transform a beacon of strength into a silent, living nightmare. The realm she left behind was indeed forced to air out its palaces and start fresh, hoping the reign of a new king would smell sweeter than the last queen's 45 long, putrid years. Her story is a chilling reminder that some crowns are heavier than others, and some victories, particularly over the self, cost more than defeat. It is a story that echoes through time, urging us to seek truth, to embrace our human fragility, and to remember that the most profound battles are often fought and lost within the confines of our own skin. And so, we close the book on a chapter of history often polished to a gleaming facade, revealing the raw, unsettling truth beneath. The story of Queen Elizabeth is a chilling testament to the paradox of power, a monarch who commanded empires, yet was ultimately enslaved by vanity and decay. Her life reminds us that even the most formidable will cannot defy human vulnerability. What do you believe was the most terrifying aspect of her hidden life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. For history's lessons are often found in its darkest corners. If exploring the hidden truths of history and the psychological depths of its iconic figures resonates with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss any future journeys. Your support allows us to continue bringing these meticulously researched stories to life.